In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to paint these pretty Cape Primrose flowers with step-by-step instructions so that you can join in no matter what your level. So let's get started. I always begin my paintings by doing a simple outline, which I trace down this way. Now, of course, you can draw them freehand, but I do provide you with a traceable so that you can trace it down if you want to. I'm using these beautiful paints by Gallo today. They're from their Signature 24 set, and here are the colours that I'm going to be using to paint this flower. But of course, as always, you can use whichever colours that you have within your own kit. I have a colour chart here, and if you'd like to make your own, I'll put it on the top of the screen right now so that you can match your colours the easy way. And all of the materials that I'm going to be using today, I will link in the description underneath this video. Watercolour is all about working from light to dark, so I'm going to start by painting the first wash for our beautiful leaves here, and we're going to be working wet in wet. Wet in wet painting simply means that you apply the water where you want to drop that paint, and I'm using my number 8 round brush to just apply the water right up to that pencil line. I'm using a mixture of forest green and fig, forest green on its own and mixed with various ratios of the fig colour here. If you haven't got these colours, you could use something like a Windsor green blue shade with a tiny bit of yellow tone just to give it that kind of bright, vibrant look. I drop in the paint like this, and you'll notice that it splurges into that damp paper, and you just manipulate the paint a tiny bit with your brush to push it up to the pencil line. The paper that I'm using today is a 300 GSM cold press paper, and the one I'm using is from Arches, but as always, it's important that you use the colours and materials that you have. I don't want you to go out and buy brand new paints just to join in with my tutorials. You'll invariably have something similar within your own kit, and it's a really good way of you getting to know your own materials. I do provide you with a line drawing and a reference so that you can join in, and I'll tell you later on in this video how you can obtain them. So you can see I'm just dropping in that darker colour, which is the forest green, just to give it a little bit of variation. We don't like to be too rigid here, just dropping in that colour with that brush and just letting it settle into the paper like this. And just adding a tiny bit more pigment here. This is the forest green. These beautiful colours are from Gallo. They are handmade in Assisi and they are stunning paints. I've used them for quite a few of my tutorials, and I know that many of you love them. So I'm using them today to show you how to use some different colours. I haven't used forest green before, nor have I used periwinkle. These are actually new colours to me, and they're lovely, just really, really vibrant colours. And you can see how they're settling into that paper really, really nicely. And just dropping in these colours wet in wet. Once that first wash is slightly dry, I'm just dropping in more pigment. I'm using my number 2 Snowdrop Brown here just to lift out a little bit of colour here and there so that the leaves have a little bit of texture. Now, we're not going straightly to our photograph today. It's a botanical painting, but we don't have to be too fussy. I want this to have a little bit of a looser look. I'm adding a tiny bit of Quinacridone Violet to the green mix just to give it, to make it a little bit more muted. We don't want the stem here to be too bright, so I'm just adding a little bit of purple to tone it down a little bit. This brush is synthetic, it's from Rosemary & Co, and it is one of my favourite brushes, and I use it all the time along with my spotters. This is a synthetic brush and it has a really fine point, making paint application so easy, and I absolutely love these brushes. Dropping in a tiny bit more of Quinacridone Violet onto the wet in wet bud here to let that paint gently merge into the paper. The little palette that you can see me using, that ceramic palette, is from Etcher, and I bought it in Jackson's, and I will list it along with the other materials underneath this video in the description box. So we need to focus on these flowers now. They're looking a little bit flat and a little bit lost. So I have a really watery mix of Periwinkle. That's a really beautiful, almost kind of like a violety blue tone, along with another mix of Tyrian Purple here. You can see I've got various ratios of water, and the other puddle at the top there is Quinacridone Violet. I'm adding a watery mix to the upper petals like this, One is wet in wet and one is wet in dry, just to show you that it doesn't really matter in this instance. And a really watery mix of the Tyrian Purple to the bottom petals like this, with a tiny bit of Periwinkle on the outside. Working wet in dry, making sure that that first wash of the leaves is totally dry before I do this, because we don't want that colour to merge into the green leaves. It's really important that you layer up your layers carefully and you don't let them merge within one another, unless of course you want them to do that. So at the start of this video I mentioned that you can trace down your drawing if you want to, that's absolutely fine, and I provide you with a really simple outline and a reference photograph, and if you want access to that, all you need to do is stay right until the end of this video, and I will put it right at the end after the outro, where you can pause the video, screenshot them and print them out and trace them down that way. Of course, there's nothing wrong with drawing them freehand, but we're all about making life a lot easier on our channel, and we don't necessarily want to waste time on the drawing. It's all about pressing on with that watercolour application and learning how to paint as you go. You can see that I'm dropping in a mixture of the Periwinkle and the Tyrian Purple to the outside edges of the petals, and working wet in wet, just applying it to the tips and letting it gently blur into that damp paint. You can see how it's given it this really beautiful soft edge where it meets the middle of the petals. So I'm applying it just to the outside edge, letting that paper do the work for me by dropping it into that damp paint. I've done the same on the other side, and now that that paper is slightly dry, I'm applying a layer of Quinacridone Violet using my number 2 pointed round here to start the middle of these flowers, making sure that it's nice thick paint. I'm taking this colour to the rest of the petal like this, cleaning my brush, patting it on the kitchen paper, and then using that damp brush to blur that colour into the existing wash. And I'll do the same on the other flower head. Picking up that pigment and dropping it in. If you are enjoying this video, could I ask you please to give me a thumbs up? It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it means more people can see it. Okay, this layer is now dry, so we need to start building up our colour to create more depth. Notice how I'm using my little brush here to apply it onto that dry paint, and I'm going to be blending it into the existing wash in the same way as I've just done. But make sure that your paint is dry before you do this, because you want to have maximum impact with that pigment. Every week on YouTube we release brand new content, and these are full-length tutorials, and if this is something that interests you, you may want to consider subscribing and hitting that little bell notification. That way you won't miss new content every single week. But if botanical painting is something that interests you and you'd rather have a slower pace, much more in-depth tutorial that you won't find here on YouTube, we also have a Patreon where we release a brand new full-length tutorial every single month. And in case this is something that interests you, let's just take a look. If you love botanical painting and want to know more, then you may want to join our Patreon. We have different membership levels so that you can take your botanical painting to the next level. With our Clematis level, you will have a full-length, in-depth tutorial every month, and if you'd like to make even more progress, then check out our Rose level, where we now have a mentorship offering feedback to help you grow. You won't find any of our Patreon tutorials here on YouTube, and you can cancel your membership at any time. So if you want to take your botanical painting to the next level, then take a look. I'll put the link in the description underneath this video. So you won't find the tutorials here on YouTube, they are exclusive to my patrons. You can see I'm adding a little bit of detail here with a mixture of Tyrian Purple and Quinacridone Violet, making sure that these petals are dry and continuing the process of building up these really dark colours here, as you can see me doing here, working wet in wet. You can see how that paint is blurring into the existing wash, and once again I'm going to be using my larger brush to merge those colours together. Notice how I'm using my brush to merge the colours into the paper. And this is my eradicator brush. This is a soft flat brush, and I'm using it down just to lift out a middle vein in each of these leaves here. By using a gentle patting motion, you'll notice how easily this paint lifts off. We're going to be working around that central vein as we work through the tutorial. Everything's now dry, so we're going to start to build up our washes once again. The same colours as before, using a mixture of forest green with a tiny bit of fig to create this beautiful vibrant green. And I must apologise for my sun shining on my paper here. My studio is in bright sunlight today, so I do apologise for that, but it's a little bit out of my control. You can see here I've added a tiny bit of purple to those mixes, and I'm just applying this colour around the outside of that vein that we've just lifted out to create a little bit of pattern and a little bit of form. Going around the outside vein that I've lifted, as you can see here, to create a little bit of interest on that petal, on that leaf, and I'm going to be doing the same on the others as I work through. I'm taking the mixture of fig with forest green over some of the areas on the leaves here, just to brighten them up a little bit, and using the tip of my brush to sharpen up the edges like this. You can see the colours that I'm picking up from my palette, just to add a bit of detail here and there. And just continuing the process on the other leaves. Working that darker colour around where the leaf meets the petal like this. You can see how I'm using the pattern motion to create some shapes on the leaf. It's entirely up to you how much detail you want to put on. Again, going back to the mixture of fig with a tiny bit of the forest green, and you can see by glazing over the colour, you can still see that beautiful bluey tone underneath, but it just brightens up that gorgeous bright bluey green leaf there, giving it another dimension. Watercolour glazing simply means that when your colour is dry, you paint over that colour with another colour, and because watercolour is translucent or transparent, you can still see that colour underneath. I'm adding a mixture here on the outside edge of the stem, which is a mixture of Quinacridone Violet with any of that green tone. You can see how it's muted it down, and adding a little bit of detail to the bud. Using the tip of my number 2 pointed round, going around the outside of the leaf here to add a bit of definition. I really love the idea of outlining things so that they really stand up and pop off that page. So again, mixing up these colours as you can see me doing here, and just adding a bit of that darker tone where that leaf hits that flower, and you'll notice how it really makes that flower stand out just by giving it that little bit of definition. Again, another layer of this purple colour. This is a Quinacridone Violet, and again just darkening up that colour, only this time not taking it all the way up. I'm pulling out some veins, as you can see me doing here, just using the tip of my brush and just creating a few little wiggly lines to give the illusion of there being veins on the flowers like this. Just using a really light pressure to create these veins. You don't want them to be too heavy. You want that nice light touch so that they look really, really natural as they hit the outside edge of the petals. So each time I clean my brush and my little puddle of water there in the middle of my palette, I'm patting it dry on the kitchen paper and blending out my paint. You can see me adding a bit more detail here to the areas I've already started to apply those veins. I'm using a mixture of Periwinkle with Tyrian Purple to do this. And just taking a little bit more Periwinkle on the top part of these petals. Just dropping in that colour, cleaning my brush and blending it through in the usual way. Tiny bit on the stem and just adding a bit more Periwinkle and blending it in with the tip of my number 2 Snowdrop Round. I'm using a plain water glaze to merge everything together and my little eradicator brush to lift off some of that colour. Gone slightly outside the pencil line there. Everything's now dry, and this time I'm going to add a tiny bit of Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. I'm using my number 0 size liner brush from Tintoretto here. Notice how I'm just adding a tiny bit of detail, using some feather-like strokes to make these little tiny hairs that you can see on the flowers like this. Very, very gentle, very light strokes. The Dr. P.H. Martin's is ideal for this, but you could, of course, use something like a white gouache if you have any within your kit. Make sure that your paint is dry when you do this, though. You don't want it to merge into that damp watercolour paint. Just continuing to add some more detail. I'm going to be outlining the flowers in a minute with that purple tone. It could be Quinacridone Violet, would work very, very well there, just to give a bit more definition. And at this point in the video, as always, I will stop talking and let you watch the rest of the video in peace and listen to some music. Remember to stay right until the end, where I'll show you the finished painting, and of course you can pause the video and screenshot the outline and the reference photograph so that you can join in. Thank you very much for watching this video, and remember to give it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.